So I see Jackie Hurst has got a question for you here.
Thanks very much, Ruben. It might be a very naive question, but in the context of what you've just said about Israel-Palestine, it's a question about context, really. I'm struggling to know, apart from in Saudi or Pakistan or Iran, where the ijma for a particular action or course of action could be located and decided.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting question, which leads to this whole concept of this monolithic Muslim world. We know, for example, that Egypt entered into peace negotiations and had a peace treaty between Egypt and Israel, which enraged other parts of the Middle East, saying that, well, what's going on here, you know? So each state is going to look after its own. Each state has to look at what is on our border. So Egypt is saying, well, hold on a second here. It's okay for you being, you know, thousands of miles away over there. This is a border we share. So there will be a ijma within each country as it stands at the moment. If that country decides to take religious direction. So Egypt may decide that it's a secular country. It doesn't take religion into its decision whatsoever, whether in its legal decisions or in its political decisions. I guess Egypt can do that. It's a sovereign state. It can do literally what it likes. Similarly, Pakistan might decide that it wants to take a completely different position. Again, Pakistan's, you know, miles away from the borders of Israel, so therefore it can choose. So really, there's no, you know, monolithic ijma or group of ulama that can decide what happens in the world because they don't have jurisdiction. Once we had nation states, that kind of monolithic kind of empire type mindset disappeared. Each nation state is a sovereign state, and it will decide what works for it. Whether it takes religious direction or not, that's its decision. Whether, you know, a country decides to become more secular or less secular, or have religion in its mantra or not have religion in its mantra, that's its decision. So, you know, I don't think you will have this kind of collective view. So you will get different views from different parts of the world.
But basically, the nation state trumps.
Pretty much so, yeah, pretty much so.
The political agent, in fact, is the one with control over.
Absolutely, yeah. It's the people that have power over the guns that have power. You know, it's the one who have power over military. It's the people who have power who can exercise force. That in reality is whoever can exercise force, they are in charge. So whatever the political power is, and it tends to be, even though in some cases superficially democratic, if we're looking at the Middle East, some cases it can be dictatorships, in some cases it can be whatever. So whoever's decided whatever method that has been used for that particular individual or those group of individuals to be in charge of that country, they then decide what works for them. Either they're taking their people's needs into consideration, or they're not taking their people's needs into consideration. That's just how that country decides to run. So it will, yes, nation states, and that's not alien, because as I mentioned, you know, pretty much after when we saw, for example, with Sayyidina Ali, we saw that we had an Umayyad dynasty pretty much forming in Sham, in the Syrian area, separate to what was forming in around Mecca and Medina. So we had two states then. And then you start to see 3, 4, 5, 6. So we had many Islamic empires. Sometimes they were enemies to each other. And therefore, those that were closer to the Mediterranean, they had links with the Europeans. So they may have had different relationships with Christians. Those that were more inland, Iraq, Iran, may have had a very different relationship towards Christians because of the interactions, those that were traveling to Bethlehem and Jerusalem from Europe. Therefore, you know, so each kind of, and this is where the professor mentioned in terms of the madhahibs, you know, you saw this different flavor, this geographical development, contextual development as well. Similarly, for example, can you eat prawns, or are prawns fish or not fish? So you find those madhabs that were developing in landlocked areas tended not to look very kindly towards prawn as fish, but those that were more closer to the sea were more open to seeing prawn as fish. So some permitted it and some didn't permit it. So you see these contextual variations, but really it's the political clout. Whoever has the political clout, they decide what legal system they use, and in terms of what relationships work for them.
So, sorry, Bob, but there are other people who I just wanted to press this a little bit. So if there were a situation in India, for example, where the ulama were consulted, is it likely that you would get a difference in consensus between, say, Deobandi and Barelvi scholars? And how would that then interact with the political agents of the Indian state, which is obviously an extraordinarily complex and fiery question? Yeah,
I guess because if you look at it, say, from a minority perspective, then, even here, say in the UK, Muslims are a minority as they are in India as a minority. So depending on what the particular topic is, whether it's trying to side up to the government or whatever it is. But if it's a case of trying to find something which is for the betterment of the Muslim community, then we saw, for example, during COVID, we found people from various factions within the Muslims, whether they were Deobandi, whether they were Barelvi, whether they were Ahl al-Hadith, whether they were, whatever they were, Shia, all came together in order to agree certain protocols of how masjid should operate during COVID, what should happen, what shouldn't happen. And there was a sort of a collective response. I guess when it's in times of peace that people start becoming separate, it's when you need to kind of club together because there's a common enemy, then you'll find that we will all come together. But as soon as there's no common enemy, then we sort of start infighting, possibly. So I don't think, if there was a particular matter that was taking place in India and the government was seeking the scholars or the Muslim scholars' view for some reason, I cannot see them, if it was something that would affect the Muslims generally, there being a different view. But I guess you would have to see, the proof is in the pudding, as they say.
Yeah, I was thinking more in the context of violence and conflict.
Oh, you mean, would there be a difference between the two parties? Maybe, possibly. It just depends what the context, what the underlying principles are. As we mentioned, it depends what the legal philosophy that's being used. It depends what the objective is. It depends what the aim is. So, for example, if it was saying that, so let's just take India, for example. I've not seen a fatwa from the Barelvi community or from the Deobandi community saying that India is Darul Harb. That would be a politically sensitive fatwa to issue. In fact, both have said it's Darul Aman, where there's lots of stuff that's still coming out from India where minorities are being targeted, mosques are being razed to the ground. Yet I've not seen a difference from my reading, and I have connections with that part of the world, with my reading, that there's been a different sort of a legal position adopted towards the state, depending on the type of schools. Modern schools that exist within the Indian subcontinent.
Thank you.